I was asked to explain this poem and elaborate further on some of the points being made. This attempt to do so will not cover everything, but will focus on the more obscure lines. Poetry should be broad enough for each reader or listener to experience it in their own way, but also to be clear enough so that the message is obtainable and can have benefit. The poem highlights contradictions between different themes that are often placed together when they should be left apart, separated when they are in fact relevant, or which are ignored completely and require more discussion in order to understand our current situation. It also highlights topics which have conflict within themselves. Examples of this are Muslims vote, or democratic war, or black and British. A Muslim who votes in a democratic election can no longer be called a Muslim. Why? Because your testimony that there is no one worthy of worship except Allah requires you to know verbally or practically that disbelief in all false deities is a condition before you can then believe in Allah. The scholars have spoken at length as to what exactly a Taghut is, and that it is not limited to a statue or individual who voluntarily receives prayers or sacrifice. Rather, it is broader than this and also includes a ruler who replaces the laws of Allah with abrogated laws from the Bible or Torah, or with man-made laws. This person also becomes a Taghut. A Muslim is ordered to disbelieve in and to avoid the Taghut, much less vote for him, build him up, and place him in the position of power to remove or carry on in a system that has long disconnected itself from the divinely revealed legislation for the creation. Legislation is only for Allah, and no one has the right to place himself in the position of Allah and abrogate or abolish that which has been clearly revealed. For those who wish to research more into this, two important notes to make is that there is a difference between a judge or ruler who ordinarily rules with Allah's laws but slips up in a specific situation due to pressure or bribery in that case, and therefore falters and gives a ruling contrary to the laws of Allah, and a ruler or judge who completely removes a law from the Sharia and replaces it with something else, making it binding upon the people thereafter. This may seem like a slight difference, but there are different rulings for these two cases, and often what we see is the ruling being deliberately mixed in order to downplay what the status of the rulers of today are. The second thing to look out for is that this topic comes under shirk, associating partners with Allah, due to Allah being the sole legislator and that right being taken away by those who replace His law. You must deal with it as such. The only time Allah has permitted the action of shirk is when you are under coercion. Look back at what the Salaf deemed coercion and not those of today. Therefore, many rules of jurisprudence that are used as justification to partake in democratic elections today do not apply. For example, rules like darura, maslaha, or lesser of two evils. If one has not fulfilled the condition of the testimony of faith, then he is not a Muslim. A pedo got bail. A pedo got bail refers not to a specific incident or individual, but rather a systematic problem which spans from the layman next door all the way up to the MPs, the President of the United States and beyond. Recent history is littered with examples of high-profile, low-moral degenerates who are allowed to persist for years and years with the backing of the establishment. Then, on the other end, are those quote-unquote patriots who wish to shift blame to the immigrants whilst they themselves take one more full, lecherous look as they drive past the secondary school, or perhaps even once they get home. The majority of these crimes are committed indoors. It is a cultural phenomenon directly related to the hypersexualized Western culture, the methodical removal of modesty and honor from each aspect of life, and the leniency of punishment for some as others are sacrificed under the bus to keep the wheels moving. If you're gonna burn it down, be consistent, not just when he's brown. The terror charge law is legislation that effectively has the power to strip the basic rights of the individual in question. It places them in a precarious position, a grey area if you will, of being between the default position of assumed innocence and the condemned guilty verdict which deems one criminal. A place, for example, that allows the basic right to remain silent and respond with no comment to be removed from the individual, and where non-compliance affords you a direct trip to prison. At face value, it's not difficult to understand the Westerner's perspective and his thinking behind this act. To gain information in a time-sensitive situation through threat and coercion. But just like any repressive regime, these kinds of laws are very rarely used as they were intended. Palestine Action comes to mind. So does the average Muslim being harassed at the airport. Or perhaps they are functioning exactly as they were intended. I will be reading excerpts from some important books on this topic shortly. The comparison made in this line of the poem simply asks you to recognize a situation in which a paedophile has more rights, protection and leniency than an innocent Muslim who previously may have watched the wrong video, visited the wrong mosque, or who has the wrong friend, or maybe even a non-Muslim, as we see today, who simply has the wrong political views. No sword, no war combats the notion that it is better to be disarmed and willing to put your trust in the good nature of the more quote-unquote civilized race to look after you and to be just. History shows that those with no weapons or inadequate weapons are soon devoured by the insatiable greed of the so-called superior races. Combat, self-defense, and war is an innate part of the human experience. This will never change. A man's survival used to depend on his ability to protect and defend. This was instilled at a young age, and his development was centered around it. We live in an age where your tools of defense have been stripped. Combat sports and training is no longer the default upbringing, and you are encouraged to drink coffee, watch TV, and rely upon the powers that be to make the right decisions. Then what happens? Well, they do what they always do. They exterminate all the brutes. In fact, this is the title of an important book, and it will be the first book we cover on this channel. Zoladex is a prescription medication that affects hormone production. There are examples where this product has been prescribed to quote-unquote trans kids. There are many such drugs, and in the poem, Zoladex is a representation of all of them and the topic as a whole. The Black Panther crew was one of the first all-black tank battalions to be entered into combat. They fought in World War II and endured the racism of the time despite their sacrifice. I find them symbolic of not only the millions of foreigners who died fighting with the promise of citizenship, equal rights, or acceptance, but also a broader issue of contribution and unappreciation. Lest we forget, is not just a phrase about the sacrifice of your European grandfathers, but the lessons that should have been learned from the promises, exploitation, and betrayal of the non-European participants. Today, we have forgotten what is in front of us, who really powers these European nations, and what would actually happen if we sent them all back. Tail of your cattle hold, that is true. You've got the right to defend unless you're black, brown. Holding the tail of your cattle comes from the proverb which states, "The one with no sword is like the one holding the tails of cattle." This, like one of the aforementioned points, highlights the idiocy of being unarmed and incapable and relying on the benevolence of man to protect you. You've got the right to defend unless you're black, brown, etc. speaks for itself. It is no secret that anyone who seeks to defy, defend, or resist state repression, invasion, and exploitation must expect to be labeled, criminalized, and therefore legally exterminated. It's funny, I was watching a video of a Marine, and he was talking hypothetically about the USA being invaded by a foreign enemy, and he said, "Try it. If they were to come and try and take even a strip of land, we would fight to the death. We Americans wouldn't concede even a portion of the land to them." And it was supposed to be a very patriotic, heroic, beat your chest moment. But all I can think of was that this is literally what every nation that has attempted to stand up to you has done. But instead of heroes, to you, they are terrorists, communists, criminals, or traitors. Sue got the job, but to keep it got a shoot lookalikes. Refers to Suella Braverman and every other politician or media head with immigrant parents that actively works for the migrant-bashing parties that seek to scapegoat years of poor economic and political decision-making onto the most vulnerable of society. Notice how these people, like the Sunaks, the Nana Akus, etc., are often more Catholic than the Pope, and must shoot down those who look like them with more vigor than their colleagues in order to remain in their position or rise up the ladder. Dark sights, party night, sisters scream, men dance. 54 countries participated in a CIA program which allowed the CIA to use their lands for dark sites. These are bases which are off the grid and are used for interrogation and torture. The CIA would abduct an individual from his home country or whilst he was in transit and transport him to said country, where there would be no public formal record of his whereabouts, and this individual would undergo the most vicious forms of psychological or physical interrogation. This transportation of captured individuals was done to avoid detaining prisoners on American soil and therefore being forced to treat them as prisoners of war and adhere to their own laws and to the legislation and rights relating to them, such as lawyers and trials. Whilst these programs were taking place, we saw a surge in Muslim parties and concerts and a general increase in the consumption of the entertainment industry. We also saw and heard stories outside of these programs of Muslim women being detained and tortured worldwide, whilst our social media was flooded with videos of supposed Muslim men dining and partying with the very individuals who are directly responsible for the internment, suffering and oppression of thousands of Muslims. Send the drones and the jackals, but why them boats coming in? This point is almost exclusively related to the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman. It is a true story of a US government official who worked as an economic hitman. His job was to travel to the leaders of foreign countries and persuade them to agree to American economic or military policy that often cripples that nation and leaves it in a mountain of debt or completely dependent upon and at the mercy of the West. If the leader of said country refuses, the jackals would then be sent in. These guys take care of the assassinations, overthrows and coups. When the nation at hand has descended into chaos and a lasting legacy of suffering and corruption has gripped the people, they, like anyone else, deemed it necessary to migrate to lands of better opportunity. The natives of this land of abundance then have the nerve to ask why the boats are arriving on their shores. Follow the righteous of the past in order to proceed. Follow the Sahabas, the companions of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, as they knew how Islam was intended to be established. They did not seek to join the ranks of evil in order to change it from within. They did not enter their chambers and demand morality and fairness from them. They did not enter their democracies and realms of logic and debate and try to outmaneuver and outmuscle the man at his own game. They simply stuck to the Quran and the way of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ until the evils that be were vanquished or were forced to respect their lives, wealth, women, honor, and land.